Hello, everybody. Welcome to the very first episode of the Mutual Aid podcast. My name is Ayman,
And my name is Israa.
and together we're forming this virtual space to talk about all things mutual aid. We're both practitioners of mutual aid, but we're also very interested in mutual aid as a form of resistance, of movement building, of community building that is more necessary now than ever. And so in today's episode, we're going to just do a sort of brief introduction about the podcast, about what we plan on doing, and basically setting the scene for what you can expect moving forward from this podcast. So basically, we envision this to be a weekly podcast. And the first few episodes, it's going to be me and Israa talking about the history, the practice, and the theory of mutual aid, so that there's sort of a base resource for what we mean when we talk about mutual aid. Then moving forward, we plan on having guests and interviews with scholars, with activists, with revolutionaries, with practitioners to create a fuller body on mutual aid, not just as something that we can talk about and discuss, but something that people are doing every single day in their local communities, in an international setting, and the like. I was quite surprised to find that this didn't already exist, that there isn't already something called the Mutual Aid Podcast. And so I think these conversations, and Israa obviously agrees with me fully, that's why they're here with me today and doing this whole project, that it is so essential, that it is something that has always existed, and that is part and parcel of every revolution, of every movement, but it is widely neglected and ignored. And it's just not as sexy, let's say, as the scenes of the masses out on the streets, of people picking up arms. It is something that it always exists and exists behind them. And so, yeah, we want to talk about all things mutual aid. And in this episode, we'll just give a brief overview and yeah. So I can start by giving a sort of brief pitch about me and my background with mutual aid, if you think that's a good idea, Israa.
Yeah, I think that'd be a great idea. Let's position ourselves.
Exactly. So I am a writer and grassroots queer organizer from Beirut. I have been interested in mutual aid for a few years now. I wrote a couple of essays, which I'll link in the show notes, I guess, about 4 years ago on mutual aid. This was a few months into the October 17 revolution in Lebanon, and I kind of noticed that there was a big split between what people are doing and what people are saying, between revolutionary discourse and revolutionary praxis. And notice obviously that the praxis is lacking. And the longer history of my interest in mutual aid is the sort of process that I think a lot of people on the left go through, which is, I started off as a bit of a liberal, disillusioned by it, obviously, especially coming from Lebanon and seeing, discovering that Obama isn't, hope and whatever, but is the head of the American empire and the capitalist, imperialist empire. And then, gravitating more towards the sort of traditional, hegemonic leftist traditions and movements, and then being disillusioned by them as well, especially in terms of mutual aid, because I see just a sort of lack of them on the streets, in the communities, in the daily practice. There is a Syrian anarchist who was martyred in 2013, Omar Aziz. And when I discovered him, it was kind of a bombshell moment for me because he was talking about the Syrian revolution, and he has this one phrase that he writes in one of his essays that the revolution remains separate from daily life. And so mutual aid to me is a tool, but it's also a kind of way of living. It's a way of integrating our politics into our daily lives. It's a way of doing the thing, on the regular, which we already do, but we talk about it as friendship, as family bonds. But thinking of it this way gives it a bit more intentionality. And so mutual aid is definitely not, you know, das Kapital. It's not a thing that's like a scientific methodology that you can apply in any setting and it's like, this is what you do. It's definitely something that's like based in respective locales, in different communities. It'll take different shapes and forms. It exists in different shapes and forms already. And basically, yeah, it presents a kind of, let's say, third way, even though third way is a bullshit term that's like co-opted by neoliberals, the Clintonites, and the whatever. Since June 2020, I've been actively engaged in a group called Queer Mutual Aid Lebanon, wherein we practice mutual aid with the queer communities in Lebanon. And I have found it to be really important work and a way to stay constantly engaged. And again, a real physical, tangible manifestation of my politics. It's not just me writing, it's not just me theorizing, it's not just me talking, but forming the exact bonds that I'm talking about. Doing the work, keeping my community alive with the analysis that capitalism, patriarchy, imperialism are literally killing us. And in order to resist them, we need to support those that are most heavily affected by them. And so in Lebanon, we are talking about the queer community. We are talking about Syrians. I mean, now in the context of war, obviously, we're talking about the entire fucking country. But, and again, in the context of war at the moment, we do see a lot of mutual aid work in lieu of the state. Anyway, um, so that's where I come from. I have a kind of like intellectual, political background, interest in mutual aid, but I also have like a hands-on experience with it, and have been for the last 4 years. And so, yeah, part of doing this project is me wanting to share some of those experiences, but also having a space where we can learn from others. Because definitely when we started, we had to do our own research and reach out to comrades, I mean, in like Greece, for instance, and be like, okay, so how do you do mutual aid? Because there's no handbook. The book Mutual Aid by Kropotkin is not a handbook, it's not a guidebook. It's very interesting, but again, it's not Das Kapital in terms of, this is how things work in our society or whatever. Anyway, that's a very long form pitch of me and my positionality and where I'm coming from vis-a-vis mutual aid. And so, yeah, I don't know, Estrad, do you want to take it away there?
Yeah. Thanks, Simon. Thank you for sharing that. So for me, mutually it's been a very similar process. I'm an activist scholar, and so there's a very heavy theory background and trying to understand the theory behind how humans and communities come together to build power. And there's the practice part where engagement in throughout COVID, just small local groups trying to support like the elderly and the more vulnerable of our community, and just also mainly reflecting on the way I was brought up. I was raised in a North African Egyptian household. So yeah, beyond the theory, there's the practice part, engaging in local groups during COVID, doing support for the most vulnerable of our community, things like grocery delivery, picking up supplies for them, things like that. And more really what's been driving me over the last couple of years to understand the role of mutual aid in our relationships and in resistance is reflection on my own upbringing as a North African Egyptian Muslim, and recognizing that while my politics between me and my parents are very, very different, the way they engage with the community is the way we approach community and relationships is similar. And so it led me into this process of really trying to understand relationships, what our system that we live under impact and erode the way we relate to each other, and how mutual aid becomes a form of resistance and a way of practicing a new way of life. Beyond that, right now, I'm deeply engaged in mutual aid work for Gaza. And again, for me, as a form of resistance, when the bombs started falling, I had this question of like, how do I show up in solidarity? I could show up on the streets, but that didn't feel like material solidarity for me. And one of the first things I did was started to look for ways to engage in mutual aid with the people in Gaza. And it took me months to be able to connect with someone on the ground who was running community kitchens. And since then, we've been working together as a collective, providing things like community kitchens, clean water distribution, baby formula distributions, and just basic survival material right now, based on the relationship he has with the community on the ground and the relationship we've built with people online to help support our work. And so I continue basically asking this question of like, how does mutual aid allow us to sustain resistance against oppression and domination? How it allows us to practice and build a new way of relating of each other. And so when the revolution with a big R comes, we're not left in this vacuum. We already
Mm,
are in practice and we're already engaged in the systems, and the transition is significantly smoother. And so, how do we build a new world in the shell of the old? And all this is actively engaged in my scholarship as I work on my doctorates, that centers the question of mutual aid as a form of resistance. So part of this podcast for me is to be able to dig more deeply into the research and develop my theories and ideas. And so y'all are all my co-researchers in this process, especially
uh,
you, Ayman.
well, yeah, I'm glad to be on board. But no, it's true, the relationship building, because when yeah, like you said, like the capital R revolution came in Lebanon, October 17, the main thing is like we're out on the streets, like getting to know each other. People
Yeah,
from across the country, from different classes, from different backgrounds, different sects.
yeah,
And mm, this was huge, literally just getting to know each other. And it was so necessary. And it was like possibly the first time in at least like 50, 60 years.
yeah.
And so mutual aid, I I don't want to do too much discussion on it here, but just in a short form, is very separate from charity,
Yeah,
wherein it might sound like similar work in terms of aid distribution, in terms of providing money, in terms of food, but is engaged at a very different level and has that political long-term relationships where it's like recognizing, yeah, the jointness of the struggles.
hmm,
And like you said, like it's about partly keeping our communities alive,
yeah,
um, because once something builds and something else happens, we're not just like completely fucked, even though we are already quite, it's things are
yeah,
very grim.
yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, COVID is definitely a landmark to discuss because when I was doing research in January 2020, I found nothing.
Mm,
There was so little about mutual aid.
yeah,
When I'd Google it, when I'd do my research, I'd find a lot about Kropotkin, I'd find a lot about the Black Panthers, but very little contemporary or very little like more recent discussions of it.
hmm,
And from reading Kropotkin, but also doing my own kind of everyday research, there's a kind of analytical looking at the world around me. Like you said, I discovered mutual aid everywhere.
hmm,
And
hmm,
the example that I often give is in the village. In whenever I'd go to my father's village, and especially when my uncle's there'd be people who would just come show up, knock on the door. We're all sitting in my grandparents' place. They see his car, they come knock on the door, and they have this like little conversation, like, hi, it's like, I don't know, a guy that works in the municipality, a guy who's like a baker or who's like a sheikh.
hmm,
And he knows my uncle is a doctor, because people know each other. And it's
hmm.
just, hey, I've got this thing, my wife has this thing. And he gives them, pro bono medical advice.
Yeah,
And it's not a charity thing. This is how the village exists as an economic, social unit.
yeah,
uh,
yep,
Debt by David Graeber. is also another really fascinating read for me about how things of communal bonds exist so much that it's almost like hard to even describe because it's so present.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we it's like intuitive when we're talking about family, and it's
Yeah.
intuitive when we're talking about friends.
Yeah.
But again, when we think of the history of capitalism, of urbanism, of industrialization, how those processes have destroyed so many of the ways that we used to exist. And in some
Yeah.
ways, you still see it, and especially places like Lebanon, in the village, in the communities, and has created such like atomized things. Like the whole thing now that it's just you and your like two or three friends and your small nuclear family.
Yeah.
But again, we in the Arab region, much like in many places in the global south, there's not that much of a distinction between my brother and my cousin.
Yeah.
As in, it's not that distanced.
Yeah.
And so those networks of support, and again, here we're talking about the family as an economic unit,
Mm-hmm.
and then the community writ large. And so, that like little story of my uncle as the doctor, and then his daughter gets married, or then his something happens to him. There's a community around him to support him.
Yeah.
And it's not out of charity, it's not out of a moral guilt or whatever, but like the community, like in very, very basic terms, needs a doctor.
Yeah.
And so if the
Yeah.
doctor's not doing well, let's say, la samhallah, he dies, it
Mm-hmm.
fucks the community up.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this all sounds so almost like archaic or like we're talking about a feudal society. This stuff, A, exists, and B, existed everywhere.
Yeah.
The reason it
Yeah.
doesn't exist as much in Europe, in the US, I mean, the US as a settler colony, totally different story, but is because of the processes of capitalism that have, and then obviously state building. And so in this time of like state collapse,
Mm-hmm.
um, there's like a return to form to these things. In Lebanon, since the economic collapse started in 2020, 2019, really, a lot of people moved back in with their families.
Mm.
And again, this is part of the reason we focus on the queer communities because in many cases they can't because they're
Yeah.
excluded from that one remaining support network
Yeah.
because of the queer phobia and sort of patriarchal domination and the like. But so yeah, I think things changed with COVID. Um, there's now like at least a few books. I think the most famous one is by Dean Spade, who I think we're gonna try
Yeah.
to have on at some point of this podcast.
Yeah.
But again, even reading that as, good and interesting again because there's just like quite literally very little,
Mm-hmm.
it it helped with the sort of understanding of the whole thing, but it's always going to be different when you practice it in your local area.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think Dean Spade had like any pretensions about like I'm writing the Das Kapital of mutual aid.
No, yeah.
And so again, it's this thing that it's like based in practice and learning even. And so having the space to talk to other people who are practicing this, I think is so important. It's so
Yeah.
important to really get an understanding of it, but also for others who are engaged in this work, who want to get engaged with this work, who don't really understand it. Because yeah, the problems we've faced over the last few years, the things we've had to sort of discover for ourselves, um, it's been hard. And
Yeah.
it would make it much easier if we could be in discussion with other people and be like, how did you deal with similar things?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Especially doing the work in opposition to the capitalist NGO charity model,
Yeah.
but then finding ourselves obviously faced with similar dilemmas. How do you make
Mm-hmm.
choices if you have limited funds? Do we set up
Mm-hmm.
criteria? Obviously, we
Mm-hmm.
don't want
Mm-hmm.
to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how do we engage in work that is both like humanitarian and political, as
Yeah.
in to and that's maybe one of the major limitations of mutual aid that like we will inevitably discuss.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah. No, I'm with you with everything you're bringing in. I think about mutual aid as a practice of it's beyond it's solidarity is a verb, right? Like it's how you show up and engage, but mutual aid is this embodied understanding that your well-being is intimately tied to my well-being. And so if one of us is hurting, it's going to impact all of us. And
Yeah.
so sharing anything I have is vital to my own survival and as well as others. Um, and yeah, resources are difficult. How do you build something and sustain our resources and keep our basics needs right? Like we're so tied up trying to survive this system of death that we live under. That for many of us, we can't even take the time to imagine what it's like to actually build something new. I know for me, had when I was living at the edge at life and just trying to keep the basic survival, right? Make sure there's food, there's housing, basic living needs. I did not have time to sit there and think politics. I did not have time to sit there and think about how the system that I live under is part of the reason. Instead, I blamed myself, and it impacted not only just my physical health, but my mental health. And a shift for me happened when I began really when I had community that was able to help me pull out of the edge and have room to breathe. And within that space, I could then start questioning what's going on, right? And look at the bigger picture around me. And I think mutual aid is vital. We keep coming back into these moments. The US election just happened a couple of days ago. It's November 7th, uh, Thursday, November 7th. And I'm currently based in the US. And so watching Trump get reelected in some ways is, yeah, well, you see a lot of liberals really upset about this and how could we do this again? Well, it's because the political system and those that you think have your back never had your back.
Mm.
And we keep saying we take care of us, but what does that actually mean? It's not making sure that the police, like, yes, the police are part of it and making sure that at protests we're protected and against the police. But what does that actually mean day to day? We take care of us.
Mm.
It's the basic needs. It's the food. It's the shelter. It's the hug at the end of the day to make sure that you know that you're not alone, right? Um, and it's the care work that sustains us. And so just like care work is invisibilized in the capitalist system, we're invisibilizing care work in this resistance work and in revolutionary work. And it's the thing that actually sustains us all. And I imagine a world where care work is centered because care work is what sustains life.
Mm.
And this is moving a practice closer to us. And it changes for me as I engage deeper in mutual aid. I notice that I care more about the life around me. I'm more sensitive to the bugs, like little things, because there's a little bit more of this understanding of the value of life.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. And these are the questions I want to explore because fundamentally also I'm curious about what is the inner work that has to be shifted within us to help us shift the whole and reimagine a new world and the way we relate to it,
Right.
beyond just the material things.
Cause shit's scary.
Shit's real scary. Yeah, we keep
Shit's real.
saying let's organize, we're not ready. Well, what does that mean? It's
Yeah.
beyond like the politics, right? Like sustain each other.
And it involves risk.
It involves a lot of risk and it involves willing to, especially for those of us that are um, in more secure positionality, whether it's economic, whether it's legal status, in all the different ways that gives us more power in the system. How are we willing to give up that comfort and share that comfort with those who don't have that access?
Mm. And I mean, I think a part of it is sort of not a leap of faith, but rather,
Mm,
I think a lot of people aren't willing to do any of these sacrifices because we definitely live in a kind of in a very, let's say, post-ideological world,
hmm hmm
where believing in anything is naive.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I have this conversation a lot with people, and it's like, well, I need this. I know I can spend, like, I need this money, and I can send
Mm,
it. I can do this, but I don't know. Yeah, it kind of, and I've heard this described, and I fucking hate it. There's a quote in the Bible, "The poor will always be amongst us,"
yeah. Yeah.
and so you're setting yourself up against an inevitable system, And
Mm-hmm.
so, but obviously this is a very capitalist logic that like keeps you isolated.
Right.
And I think the first leap is an emotional one.
It is.
Um, is one in which because there's like a comfort in the isolation. There's a comfort in
Mm-hmm.
the alienation and the atomization.
Mm-hmm.
It's me against the world.
Yep.
And even though we hate it, we talk about it and we talk against it as a kind of like soul-crushing thing,
Mm-hmm.
but it's comfortable, to a certain extent.
Yep.
But it does limit what life even is so
Yep.
much.
Yep.
And it sounds so like deep or like too deep for this conversation in terms of it almost sounds like a what's the term? I don't know. I mean, it is a bit spiritual. Like it's talking about I don't know. Like I find myself, I've been faced with death numerous times in my life, coming from
Yeah.
Lebanon, several
Yeah.
explosions and the like, and but also like leaving home and really having to contemplate like, okay, wait, what do I want to do? What do I want to do with this like one life that I have?
Mm-hmm.
I am also someone who was raised functionally atheist. I come from a
Mm.
very strange but interesting like minority religion from Lebanon, the Druze. We believe in reincarnation, but also we believe no one should be able to read the book unless they're in the clergy. And so basically, I never had a very strong sense of this like larger narratives um, of God, of the end times, of karma, any of it. I really didn't have a strong sense of it at all. And so I'm kind of like very rooted in just the world as it is, which can
Mm.
be very crushing, but also it's this thing that it's led me to think, okay, so I do have this one life. I don't necessarily believe in the afterlife or in an afterlife. Um, I don't necessarily believe in any like karmic virtue.
Mm.
I also just don't believe in my own success. I don't believe in any of this stuff people say of like, I want to make great stuff so I'm remembered when I'm dead. I'm dead. I don't care. I'm not going to care. I'm going to be dead. And so, quite literally, it's been this thing of, okay, what do I want to do? What is my purpose in life? And it's like, I want to alleviate the suffering of the people around me. I want to do work that, you know, rebalances. And again, because I see the systems, I obviously live under them and they're fucked. And I see those that are unjustly, unfairly victimized and oppressed by them.
Mm.
And I don't have a utopic image of we do this and it's all going to be good. But like
Yeah.
in the time that I have, I want to, I don't know, spread the love,
Mm.
um, sustain people, keep people whatever. Hopefully, not just keep people surviving, but keep them thriving in a way. And again, that is part of the work. Like not thriving again in a capitalist sense, but so yeah, so mutual aid for me, it's this there is like a spiritual component to it,
Yeah.
an emotional one where it's like I don't know, how do I situate myself? I feel very depressed and very whatever, so what can I like physically manifestly do with it?
Yeah.
And there is a kind of I don't know, an immediacy to it, which I find very important.
Yeah. Yeah.
You go online and you see people on the left talking and planning and not really planning, just talking. And there's a kind of like خلاص, like let's keep talking. First of all, you made a very good point. Who are the people that are talking?
Yeah.
Because yeah, people who are constantly working to make ends meet are not able to engage in these discussions with the same kind of frivolity. The ways that they would engage in these conversations are also very different because there's that
Yep.
urgency of not let's read fucking um Baudrillard. There is
Yeah.
also that exclusion, like who is reading and able to discuss Baudrillard. There's like a class thing there for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I have found in my work like some of the most fascinating, insightful, powerful things I've ever heard people say come from people who never have a platform, who
Yep.
are peripheralized, who are kept on the margins by capitalism, by patriarchy, by whatever. And again, I'm not talking about like political, you know what I mean? I'm talking about like the goodness in people, like the kind of the sort of small hopes of humanity. Um, I don't know how to explain this.
No, I understand
It's
what you're
just this kind of
saying.
thing, just as a small example, like kind of someone we're supporting, and this I think is the ultimate goal of mutual aid. Someone we're supporting then sees the work we're doing, sees that none of us are like benefiting from this in any way except for, we're not getting paid, we're not getting any social status or anything. And then them replicating our work, being like,
Yeah,
oh, okay, A, I can do this, B, I want to do this, B, I've a real life example of, the effect that this can have on someone, and so I want to do this with someone else.
yeah.
And but also that there's like a humbleness.
Hmm.
There's a kind of literally amidst the bombing, there are still people in Lebanon, that are thinking and talking about Gaza
Yeah.
because there's that God bless them,
Hmm.
Um, there's a sort of awareness. And again, we've given sometimes offered money to people, they ask for less because it's like, well, there's someone else who's in a worse situation than me, even
Yeah.
though they're in like a fucked situation.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah.
It's this deep connection of like where, yeah, we're in like there's intimacy to it. We're in this together. And so how do we share what we have together? Um,
Hmm.
and I think like it is actually even more important in this moment in time for us to be engaging and elevating these voices, these peripheralized voices, and engaging in the real life examples because we are in a moment where mutual aid had been so successful during the COVID period in building alternative power and mutual aid and kind of starting to engage people more politically that now the system is co-opting mutual aid. Uh, it is over the last few years, like you said, like all these things are popping up, but it's now being used in a way where the politics is being erased. And this is part of the resistance. And so like I think it's part of our responsibility for those of us who do engage in like academics and have platforms like this to be able to make space for the voices that are being silenced and to continue to elevate the periphery to counter these hegemonic voices.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and really encourage like looking at how we're practicing it in the like in all of our relationships. Like you said, like I mean, one of the things that I stood out to me in the work with Gaza is there was a understanding of what's going on. Yes, these like people are literally being erased off of social media and all the mainstream media, but they had a deeper analysis of what they needed, why they needed it, and the root cause of their their challenges than any academic article I could have read, you know?
Mm.
Um, and these material can like we talk about material conditions and elevating it's like but our material conditions like beyond just fighting the state for our this abstract idea of material, what is the things that we could do immediately right now to help our material conditions to
Mm.
create more space for resistance and revolution and just for new things to emerge, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, 100%. This is the thesis that I have, I think in my last video essay, um, and I bring in, I think, bell hooks
Mm,
that the margins is not a place that people like aim to like run away from, but a
mm,
place that is like a site of resistance, a site of discourse, of site of like practices
mm-hmm.
that we can all learn from. It's not just
Yeah,
like, oh, sad. It's like
yeah,
because yeah, there is. Uh, I mean, I think Gaza really depicts so vividly in the most intense way possible the flaws of the system that
yeah,
exists today.
yeah.
Um, the exact same forces are sending all the munitions
Mm-hmm.
and airdropping
Yeah. Aid.
food that
Yeah.
is killing people.
Yeah.
That is oftentimes expired food. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
literally, or like, and it's those.
Many times also poisoned by the occupation, right? So like they're controlling at so many levels.
It's so fucked. And what really needs to happen is stop the bombing,
Mm-hmm.
opening up these border crossings. It's, but it's like a really, really morbid example of how the charity industrial complex works.
Right. Right. Because now
Um,
in these situations, when you need the aid also the most, these charity organizations are not willing to go in, right? And yes, they're being targeted. Yes, there's would go back to the occupation, but they're also it's the people now who are living it who can't get away from the bombing that are forced to basically figure out how do we take care of each other, you know?
no, yeah,
Uh,
precisely. And it's like, and so again, it's that two-sided thing of it all, where it's like we need to alleviate the hunger, and we need to also stop the fucking source of the hunger.
yep.
And so a lot of these charities are doing important work and good stuff and have for a while, but it's like they will never present any actual solutions because in this case it's the end of Zionism and
Right.
American imperialism,
Right.
and that is not in the remit of what charities claim to want to be doing.
Right.
I mean, Bill Gates is never going to, form a kind of militia army or anything.
Right.
But so that's why another really important person for me, and it's just like a mini small part of a bigger text by Arundhati Roy, the NGOization of resistance.
Mm.
And I've definitely experienced this a lot in Lebanon. We have a lot of NGOs, and there's this kind of thing where it's like, okay, I have these politics. I also have to make it under capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there are these groups that I can sort of advocate and do stuff and write my texts, but it's always going to be disconnected from the community, but also from what needs to be done and what the community needs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why in our work we hear so much antagonism, so much hatred from especially like working class and poor queer folk and trans people against the NGOs. And again, their analysis on the NGOs, I don't need to read any more about the NGO, the shit of that structure. I just talk to the people who are,
Right.
relying on that support, who are then seeing like how much money they have, like the NGOs that is, and how little
Mm-hmm.
money that the people who rely on them. And it's like, fuck you, that's our money.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
you're getting paid in dollars, you're getting paid well, and I don't know, you're not really doing the stuff we need because they're not listening to them because they're listening to their donors, they're listening to their own analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and then also not really listening to the critiques of the structure as a whole because it's a very hierarchical system. And
Yep.
what happens there is that it's disconnected even further. I don't know. I have huge
Yeah.
critiques. This will come out later, but it's just the kind of thing where, again, it's not my critique from reading Arundhati Roy and reading whatever. It's like from talking to people over 4 years
Yeah.
who, again, are kind of oppressed and victimized and shat on, not just by the state, not just by the sectarian sort of parties, not just by the society, but also by these NGOs who claim to speak on their behalf.
Yep. Yep.
And yeah, it's just the kind of thing like, what do they need? Sometimes they need money. And the NGO is, again, very bureaucratic. That's another thing. Bureaucracy is a massive barrier to these things. It creates this separation, again, even just emotionally. There's a person, okay, fill out this form and we'll look at the request as opposed to like sitting and talking to the person. 'Cause that's hard.
Yep.
It's difficult to hear someone, and especially when I don't know. Anyway.
No, it's true. It's true. It's a I mean, and beyond that, there's the ways of it. It allows that state to basically remove any responsibility for social care, right? And so
Mm,
the state gets to continue its exploitation and destruction. And outsource these to these NGOs while saying like, no, we're supporting it with these grants, which require really strict requirements. So like in San Francisco right now, there's been laws passed where uh, anyone who requires any type of assistance has to be drug tested. And three strikes and you're out situation, right? Like you, first time they'll send you to rehab, second time they'll send you to rehab, third time you're going to jail. And so now we're creating a pipeline for poverty. Many people, like with no options to, first off, there's not enough housing out there. There's not enough shelter support. There's no social structure, and we're not addressing the core issues themselves, but we're criminalizing everyone. Encampment sweeps like are disastrous. What people lose sets them back for years. But we're not going to question any of that stuff, right? We're going to demonize these people and we're going to create NGOs that give us the illusion that things are being done. And the problem is just too complicated to figure out, you know?
Mm.
And so in a lot of ways, it's stabilizing this system of death and destruction, and deeming an entire population who by based on identity and based on your ability to comply, whether you get support or not, and what support is and what quote unquote community is, right? And the rest of us are just kind of left trying to figure out what to do and without resources, many people, right? And I think that's kind of where a lot of we have to get creative about what that looks like
Mm.
and understanding like, yeah, we really do we need to reshuffle how material resources are currently
Mm.
um, distributed. There's no question about that. And again, I go back to the question of like, so how do those of us in higher positions of power who have these understandings maneuver this, right? Like, can we write grants that allow us to shift over and uh, comply as we need to get the approval from the system, but give this like when you give it to the community, they have the freedom to do what they want. And that's a question I'm really asking myself around as institutionalize the mutual aid work in Gaza as a way for protection from what's happening. There's no question that uh, there's a criminalization that's been happening for a while towards mutual aid. In the U.S., you have the Atlanta Solidarity Fund for the Defend the Forest folks, and they really set up this precedent, the government and how they attack them, that is now essentially starting to be played out, and you're seeing played out with mutual aid support in Gaza. And so there is this move to try to criminalize people, and so we're being forced to institutionalize. But then how do you
Mm.
institutionalize without becoming compliant and being part of the system, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and we don't like this is the reality like we live in right now. The system has the power. We need to pull it like somehow take it back, and that does require us engaging with it at some level while we also rebuild our communities through how we engage with each other and support each other and relate to each other. And ideally, the way I imagine it is we're doing this emotional, personal relationship work immediately with each other and with whatever we have to meet material needs. And as the flow of material from the state comes in by those who are able to maneuver these systems, then we are able to build up the power of the community more, right?
Mm.
Um, I don't know. Who knows? This is like the experiment I'm trying to figure out right now. I haven't really, I mean, the Panthers are a great example of uh, resistance and revolution through mutual aid. And the way like the state finally shut them down is by co-opting their programs with the free
Yeah.
breakfast program, you know? And so there's power there. And how do we recapture that and yeah, engage with that?
No, yeah, you bring a lot of really important points up, and one of them is, I think, the major critique of mutual aid, which is, does it provide like an excuse, an alleviation? These are things that the state should be providing. The state
Right.
should be providing support for. And so if we provide it, does that not give the state? And this is what the NGOs are and
Hmm.
how NGOs have functioned under neoliberalism for the last 30 years.
Right.
But I have a response to that critique, which is
Yeah. I think it's the same response.
yeah, which is like I don't believe if like enough people die, like As in, we lose ourselves, we lose
Yeah.
our capacities to care or whatever, or to
Yeah.
build power if we just let people die because it's like, while we say, uh-huh, see, you should be taking care of them.
Yeah.
Also because these are not moral entities.
Yeah.
Again, we saw in COVID, they let millions of people die across
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah.
And if anything, how I mean, COVID never really ended, but how it ended in this kind of hegemonic sense is with the vaccines, is with the whatever. But it's like, okay, those that are still going to be affected by it, which is most people, um,
Mm-hmm.
they'll just get affected. We
Yeah.
need to go back into capitalism. We need to go back into production, into the marketplaces, into the productions.
Right.
Um, but so, yeah, there's a kind of, but I do hold on to that critique, and I think about it a lot
Mm-hmm.
because we, in a very interesting way, we have become, as queer mutual aid, sometimes a reference point for the NGOs.
Mm.
So we get contacts from people that are in LGBTQ plus NGOs, being like, "We have this person we can't support. Can you support them?"
Oh, wow.
You know what I mean?
Wow.
Like the people who are meant to be alleviating from the state,
Yeah.
we're alleviating them, and again, we're in that same situation where it's like, no, fuck you. You can mobilize your own resources, use your own fucking salary, talk to
Yeah.
your donors, get into those arguments.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, we have this person, then, we kind of have a
Yep.
responsibility.
Yep.
So there's definitely conversations there. We will definitely, in later episodes, get into that.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah,
it's
there's a lot there.
there's a lot. I remember literally during the beginning of the economic collapse, Nasrallah goes on TV and says that we should all start doing like little gardens on our balconies. Which again,
Great
I mean,
idea.
first, great idea, yeah, but also, no, fuck you.
Yeah.
Like you're defending a system that is starving us. Like
Yeah.
not just
Yeah.
as
Don't.
the party, but like as the whole
Yeah.
sectarian oligarchical system, the banks that have stolen our money.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, I mean, also interestingly enough, he talks about the balcony, which is a very private individual space, not built community agriculture projects like on
Mm-hmm.
roofs, for instance, where it's like the whole building or like in areas.
Mm-hmm.
But there is also another big critique, which is again something that is going to be discussed a lot, which is the difference between sharing resources between us and sharing
Mm-hmm.
resources like or taking resources from them, from the
Mm-hmm.
elite,
Mm-hmm.
from the whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of mutual aid work, those that are engaged in those that are like, it's usually people of relatively the same class, relatively same positionality, whatever. Like it's resource sharing between us.
Yeah.
And like you said, with institutionalizing, it's like, okay, well, we need to request some of these things, but obviously, in a lot of the cases, and especially as we're seeing how like capitalism in the last, especially decade, has just is like runaway capitalism. The
Yeah.
amount of money and the concentration of wealth that even just someone like Elon Musk has is absurd.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
absolutely does not make any sense.
Yeah.
The sort of like checks and balances historically have always been, they get too wealthy and then people rise up and then I don't know, there's sort of concessions.
Yeah.
Like you said, very important, not just the Black Panthers breakfast program that then the US government co-opted, um, but I think this is essentially how all social welfare programs, how even something like voting, how democracy, um,
Yeah.
all these historical processes happen. Power never concedes, it never commits suicide. It is
No.
forced to. I
Yeah.
have the strong belief, I think it's like Rudolf Roca or something, where it's like um, there are certain demands, there are certain public pressures, and that they give in to those pressures
Yeah.
because otherwise they might be overthrown. So, like how any of the welfare programs in Europe came about is a time of revolution where it's not out of the goodness of their bourgeois aristocratic hearts. No,
Right.
it's the people are at the fucking gates and they're demanding like everything, and so give them
Mm.
something and it'll placate them.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean that's a very simplistic view of history, obviously, but I think it's important just to make it clear that all the sort of good stuff we have, even the fucking weekend,
Yeah.
we were we were not given it. You know, these are things that were taken, and it requires movements that have teeth. That's an important one. And again, within the critique of how are we building teeth,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
that's, I mean, I will recognize here that when we talk about mutual aid, we're not talking about an all-encompassing philosophy for revolution,
Yeah. No.
but a part of that is quite often neglected. Again,
Yeah.
Kropotkin's book, the subheader, Mutual Aid, a Factor of Evolution,
Yeah.
right? It's a factor. He
Yeah.
acknowledges obviously competition, he acknowledges obviously force and the like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but in the same way that it is a factor of revolution as well.
Yep. It's true. I'm thinking about the Zapatistas right now and how for them and before they took their revolution started in the 90s, in 94, um, it was a period of building the alternatives, like they building schools, hospitals, libraries, the community that's going to sustain, and the relationships and the way of governing and way of being that's going to allow them to take it to the next level, right? While they figure out the arms and they figure out all the little other things and get the resources that they need to do what they need to do, right? And I imagine like really this is the stage collectively as a whole. I feel like this is where we are right now. Uh, Rising up has not been working. How many times have we seen the streets being lit up on fire in the last few years,
Mm,
only to be silenced with some fake laws? Like in the US now, all the laws that were put into place to try to curb police violence are being rolled back. And
mm,
not just because of Trump, but also the Democrats, right? Like
mm.
look at Harris and her alignment with police force and her consistent language of the rule of law. And
Yeah,
so, like, going up to arms right now is not working. It's not, we're not organized enough. We don't know each other enough. We don't trust each other enough to be able to take that risk.
yeah,
And so, take it back, build with each other, connect with each other, take care of each other, figure out how to like build a life together the way you would build a life with your partner. And then we could go to the next step.
yeah. 100%. I mean, I don't know. I feel like that's the perfect way to end, actually.
There we go.
Yeah, because that is where we're at, and I find myself going to these protests sometimes and being like, "Okay, and then what?"
Yeah.
And clearly seeing in the last year, it not working.
Yeah.
The Israelis are hella emboldened. I mean, they fucking invaded Lebanon and they're bombing Lebanon now. And
Yeah.
it's like, but also, yeah, over the last few years, um, I mean, the Democrats lost. They lost hard. And not
Mm.
just, and even the popular vote, actually. This happened,
Yeah.
I think it's the first time in a very long time.
Yeah.
And because, khalas, again, obviously in our conversations, we're not going to be talking much about electoral politics because we don't give a shit about
No,
electoral politics. But,
no, no, no.
any hopes that people had, um, it's, I mean, Kamala Harris had no, I mean, plan or vision except just
Right.
kind of the same, but now catering a bit more to the right. Where it's
Right.
like, okay, why would you want, light wing, right, whatever, light right
Right.
wingism when you can have the
Yeah.
real deal?
Yep.
And the
Diet Republican. I saw the term diet Republican when we
diet
have the
Republican, yeah.
yeah, it's true.
And so, I mean, this is the crisis we find ourselves in, which also has like a lot of historical precedents, which is that the center will gravitate towards the right as opposed to the left, and that the
Mm-hmm.
left has to force it.
Yep.
And then I don't know. I also need, I mean, we all need to get off Twitter, like for
Yeah.
sure now.
Yeah.
But in general, we all need to get off social media.
Oh yeah.
Use it as a way of connecting, but not as the site itself.
Yep.
Um, and yeah, talk to each other. Again, things are fucking messy. It's not going to be easy and loving and great. I mean, there's a lot of love in it, but there's also just a lot of conflict. There's a lot of bullshit. Humans are fucking annoying,
Yeah.
but it's like we don't have anyone else.
Yep.
We don't. There's also a phrase that I think about a lot. There is no justice. There's just us.
Mm.
And I obviously have no faith in a comrade leader who is going to come back, Abdel Nasser or anything like that. Um, it's us. It's us
Yep.
in all our messiness, in all our complexity, in all our whatever. And we have to utilize it. This is all we have. And again, I mean, I'll emphasize obviously that I think it's enough.
Yeah.
I think we do have the capacity. Again, I've shat a lot on people, but also I love people. Um, and I have only my hope in people because again, the systems are fucked, the leaders are
Mm.
fucked.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so in all our messiness, we need each other.
Yep. Yeah.
And so
We have
yeah,
to figure out. Yeah.
yeah. And so moving forward, we're going to be having a lot of conversations. The next few episodes will be divided, I think, 3 episodes: history, practice, and theory. It might
Mm.
change. Um, and maybe another one about like contemporary examples.
Mm.
But then, yeah, we're gonna be aiming for an episode a week, interviewing people. Isra and I both just came back from a conference where we met a lot of really cool, really inspirational revolutionaries and activists in a lot of different locales, mostly in the global south.
Yeah, I'm really excited to bring like a lot of those people. It's going to be some really good conversations.
Yeah. And so some of it will be just like individual, some of it will be on topics. And of course, anyone listening, if you have someone in mind or some movement, some practice that you would want us to examine, look into, discuss, maybe even if you yourselves are engaged in similar work, you can reach out to us. I don't know how, actually. We haven't set up anything. We have no email or anything, but I mean, I'm on Instagram at politically depressed. Oh, I mean, we should have mentioned this from the very beginning. This podcast is a part of From the Periphery Media Collective.
Yeah.
And actually, I should just wrap up in general. So, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. The very first episode. This podcast is supported by From the Periphery Media Collective, which is a media collective bringing together voices from the global south in conversation with each other, building internationalism from below, and is a community supported media collective. So if you like this podcast, if you want to help this podcast continue, then please consider becoming a member of our Patreon. Patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. Obviously, links below. Becoming a member not only helps us support this podcast and all the other podcasts, including my own, Politically Depressed, but you also get access to a lot of like cool exclusive content, early access, and you join us in the chat as well as like we have like a monthly hangout. And so, yeah, please consider supporting us. This is obviously a new podcast, so please leave it a review or a rating wherever you're listening to it to help us boost in the algorithm. And of course, tell your friends.
Mhm.
And I think that's it for this episode. Thank you so much, Isra. I think that actually worked very well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All
that's
right.
perfect.
So thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you all next time.